What's going on, guys? Wanted to make a real quick video to share some tips with you on how to more efficiently cut with your porta-band or metal cutting bandsaw. Now what I have in my shop is simply a vertically mounted quarter cable porta-band, and I use this thing for just about everything in my shop, from cutting the profiles on my blade blanks to cutting the handle materials, the kydex, or really any smaller pieces that I need to cut or profile. This thing is invaluable. But one thing I've noticed, especially after cutting materials like aluminum, titanium, or even high carbon tool steels, is that the blades tend to stop cutting as well after a few minutes of cutting. And what happens, not only are you rounding your points off on your teeth a little bit as you're using this, but probably the biggest contributor to a poorly cutting bandsaw blade, at least when you have a newer blade, is that the teeth tend to gum up and get chips caught in between them. Now, one quick way of removing the chips that I found is to take anything that's softer than the steel that you're cutting, maybe a piece of wood. Sometimes I use scrap pieces of kydex that I kind of leave floating around the saw, and they tend to grab a lot of the chips out of the teeth. G10, micarta, anything like that. You can even use a belt cleaner and kind of push that into the side of the blade on either side, and then kind of cut down the middle. And that rubber will tend to grab a lot of those chips out. Now, the chips that have kind of welded themselves in place or are a little more stubborn, you could take a wire brush, kind of go on either side and then across the front, and to get a lot of that out. Sometimes you can even use your fingernails, and then just jog the blade real quick, and that'll move you down to do another 5 or 6 inches depending on how deep of a throat you have on your porta-band or metal cutting bandsaw. Now lastly, another thing that really helps me tremendously, especially when cutting my blade profiles out, is to add just a little bit of thread cutting oil or lubrication to the outside of the blade. There's a couple ways to do this, so you definitely want to try not to get any, or as very little as you can, on the inside of the blade, as that's what rides on your tires for your idle wheel and your drive wheel. And if you start getting too much oil on the inside of the blade, it'll coat these tires and really give you a hard time trying to keep your blade on. Anytime you put pressure or twist at all, your blade's going to track off and pop right off your saw. So just try to keep it on the outside. I found that it really tends to stay there and not work around as much to the inside. And just enough of it will kind of work itself onto the teeth to give you a much cooler cut, and tend to keep a lot of your chips from sticking into your teeth. Now, one thing you will want to keep in mind is that your chips and your dust are going to tend to stick to your table and your workpiece a little bit more. You just need to be vigilant in wiping that off or blowing that off as you're cutting, and you shouldn't have a problem. So one way that I like to apply the oil, I just put a couple drops right there on the inside of the table and the blade, and it tends to stick there just enough that I can turn the blade on and give it a pretty good coat. Sometimes I'll even hold the applicator up to the blade and just kind of let gravity do the work. I may even help it along with my finger, though I don't recommend that, as that's a good way to cut your finger and get all kinds of nasty oil and dirt into the cut. Probably a shop towel would be a little bit better for that, or even a applicating brush. Another thing you could do is cut into a piece of flat stock and kind of use that as an area to pull your oil up and to apply it to the outside of the blade. And what you should notice is that your cuts will be a little bit cooler and a heck of a lot smoother. You won't get as much sticking into the teeth as you're cutting. And it really does tend to last quite a bit. I mean, it won't last for several minutes or hours and hours, but it should give you at least a couple more inches of cutting per couple of drops that you apply. And another thing that it really helps is to keep the blade from binding as you're making inside and outside cuts. So just a couple of quick tips, guys. And if you guys have any ideas or tips that you use, by all means share them below. And as always, thanks for watching. We'll see you.